Hello and welcome to this DW Business Special. I'm Rob Watts and this week we're talking all about the future of globalization. The World Economic Forum meeting in Davos this year came with the usual messages about working together to solve the world's problems, but this time round it also came against the backdrop of a fragmenting world. The war in Ukraine has forced nations to pick sides when it comes to trade, often between the West and the rest, i.e. those countries unwilling to condemn Russia for its actions. What's more, concern over Chinese dominance has seen Europe and the US take up a less cooperative and more competitive stance towards the Asian economic powerhouse. Well, to help us answer the question, is this the end of globalization? I'm joined firstly in the studio by DW's Ben Fazulin. He's been our man at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, and you're fresh off the plane as well from Switzerland.
Not all that fresh.
Yeah, we almost thought you weren't going to make it, so we're very happy to have you with us. We're also joined on the line by Anahita Toms from multinational law firm Baker McKenzie. She's going to be able to give us some insight into how world trade is changing. Thanks a lot for joining us, Anahita. It's good to have you. Now, I'll come back to our guests in a moment, but first to explain. Talk of the end of globalization comes after decades in which the received wisdom has been that international trade leads to a more peaceful world. Well, since the turn of the millennium, we've seen countries cooperating on goods and services like never before. In the year 2000, just have a look here, global trade amounted to 6.4 trillion US dollars, but last year it was more than triple that at $19 trillion. Even the coronavirus pandemic couldn't stop it hitting a record high. So I'm going to begin by asking Ben Fazulin here in the studio with me. You've been at Davos. What's the feeling there? Is globalization something that they're talking about, or deglobalization, perhaps more accurately?
This was a completely different Davos to any other Davos I've been to. This was my 7th or 8th, and every year it's about new partnerships, trying to make globalization work, trying to make a more global world, despite all of the criticism that you get that it's only the wealthy who are benefiting from it. In this case, we've suddenly hit this point where everything's falling apart. People are running around trying to do deals with this country and that country, and there was an urgency to this Davos because of Ukraine, but also almost a panic behind the scenes. And I wouldn't say that we're seeing a deglobalization, but rather a push towards a more sustainable globalization. So de-risking of supply chains. I spoke to one investor from Zurich who said that we're too lazy, we're too cheap, and we don't learn. Russia had turned off the taps before, as far as gas and Ukraine go. Yeah. But it doesn't take a war or a pandemic. All it takes is a ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal to show that the system doesn't work.
Yeah, it's amazing that we have had all of these things just in the last couple of years. Is Davos traditionally, is it fair to say, been a place where you're hearing pro-globalization messages?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's where they've always said, come on, guys, we've got to work together. We've got to make this world a better place. But that plan's not going to work anymore because of the way China's going, because of what Russia's done, and also the economic side of things. We've got to remember that China is no longer going to be giving us that stellar growth that the world has relied on for so long. And this year, we could see China shrinking for the first time. We could see the US outpacing Chinese growth for the first time.
Yeah, we're going to talk plenty more about China during this, of course, and we'll also be talking a great deal about Russia as well. But I just want to bring in Anahita Toms for the first time. Thanks a lot for joining us once again. Can you tell us whether you think that we are heading for a world actually where it's not so much about free trade between nations, but actually where it's more restricted and more selective?
I would say that we are definitely more selective and we have to work towards diversification. But globalization is not a thing of the past, although the frontiers have changed. And we're talking about geopolitical tensions, but we have also seen a pandemic, climate change, and a question about our values, our common values. And because of these frontiers changing, we really need to invest more into innovation, we also need to invest more in resilience in our supply chains, and this definitely includes diversification as well. But I think we also need to have a very honest discussion, because there are some products we cannot or do not want to do without. And we can discuss about various products, for example, cobalt in Congo, and replacing specific products is challenging. And I would say the following, because it was subject to various discussions in the past few months. It is important to keep in mind that withdrawing from critical regions is not always the solution. There are factories that would have to be closed because clearly they are handled under very bad conditions. But our responsibility is to help local communities get better, because what is clear too, that many people are dependent on their incomes, and if Western companies just leave, that can have major impacts on the local community. So I would echo that what we need to do is to work towards a more sustainable trade relationship, and that includes having honest discussions.
I think that also includes not just companies, because companies have been, working out that their customers and their workers want to work for a company or be involved with a company that has values and has morals. But it's also governments, governments' choices with whom they're going to work and do trade deals.
This is something that I do want to talk a bit about, actually, which is how much government should be taking into account the ethics of the places in which they want to invest and to trade. I actually want to just hear a soundbite from someone from Davos. So the war in Ukraine has obviously brought about a massive shift in global trade. The West and its allies have begun to isolate Russia wherever it isn't too self-destructive to do so. So just have a listen to Director General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, speaking in Davos.
Free trade has brought a lot of prosperity and wealth to all of us. But the problem is that it has a price. Because some of this trade, some of this economic interaction with authoritarian regimes is undermining our security. And then we have to choose security instead of vulnerability and over-reliance on authoritarian regimes. So this idea that, we should have free trade in natural gas, meaning we can buy as much gas from Russia as we want, that's wrong. It's dangerous.
Yes, Ben, is that a message that you were hearing while you were there, that you need to be more selective, or Western nations need to be more selective about who they trade with?
Well, more multinationals, we're already seeing this, are pulling out of Russia. We just had Starbucks was the latest. More multinationals are pulling out of China as well. There are reports that Apple could be, which would be very interesting. And the West is likely to become a warier importer of Chinese goods. At the same time, China is looking at becoming more self-reliant. And we've heard that time and again over the past years from Xi Jinping, and just this week as well.
Actually, good that you mentioned China, because that is something that we do need to talk about, because Europe is heavily reliant on China for all manner of technologies, particularly future technologies and those associated with decarbonisation. Just have a look here when it comes to electric car motors. The EU imports 65% of its raw materials. Just look here. The country also accounts actually for 54% of turbine components. And it's not just in Europe's clean energy sector where we see domination from China. There's a key component of solar panels. It's called polysilicon. And over the past decade, China has increased its share of the global market to achieve almost total domination on that front. I just want to bring in Anahita Toms again on this one. Anahita, is the idea of trying to change countries through trading with them, Wandel durch Handel, that Germany in particular has sought to espouse over the years, is that something that's been shown to have failed?
I get this question all the time. To think that trade interest would lead to an export and universal adoption of the Western democratic model everywhere in the world has always been a wide-eyed approach. If you look at the democracy index, you are aware that 1/3 of the world's population lives in dictatorships still. This being said, to think that one has no influence on a country where you have entrenched trade is also incorrect. I would say it is a nuanced analysis that we need to have and again, an honest discussion. Although the export of the democratic model has not been effective in some countries, economic relationships have influence and also influence on political decision making, but also particularly on living conditions of local communities. And we also have to take into account the positive examples. If one regards NATO and the EU, historically these countries, as you are very well, were often at war, and through interdependence and deep trade ties, a platform for dialogue, continuous dialogue was created. Of course, there are common values here, but I think just because not everywhere we were quote unquote successful, I think the underlying mechanisms of international cooperation and also through mechanisms like the WTO, we can trigger change. And I think also when you look at how quickly can things actually change, I think it is also an investment in time. And I just want to reiterate, just because in a few cases it didn't work, it doesn't mean that through trade we cannot positively influence.
Europe has tried to hang on to that idea of being able to work with China rather than against it for a little bit longer, at least, than the United States. I want to play you another clip here. Secretary of State Antony Blinken from the United States, and he's made it very clear that the US sees China's increasing dominance as a threat, and one that even surpasses Russia.
Even as President Putin's war continues, we will remain focused on the most serious long-term challenge to the international order, and that's posed by the People's Republic of China. China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and, increasingly, the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. Beijing's vision would move us away from the universal values that have sustained so much of the world's progress over the past 75 years.
Ben, decoupling from China is a phrase that we've heard a lot. Decoupling was a bit of a buzzword in general, and regionalization, localization, all things that were talked about an awful lot at Davos. Are we entering a more fractured world?
Definitely, and I would call it a disentanglement and regrouping, because it's not just, it's a two-way road here. China is heavily reliant on so many of its geopolitical rivals. So Taiwan, as far as products go, its aerospace industry, it's like 98% reliant on foreign help as far as that sector goes, but also foreign expertise. So Germany, Japan, South Korea, Singapore. It's going to be complicated, and we're entering a very complicated stage, I think, in globalization. And it's going to take a lot of, like I said before, behind the scenes work. And I saw that as far as the oil sector went when I was in Davos, with a lot of people heading to the Saudi Arabia house, including Israel, including Germany, including all of these big countries that are trying to fill the gap, because it takes time, as we heard from our guest.
Yeah, they're playing catch-up somewhat as well.
They are, and it's an urgent situation because Germany's trying to wean itself off oil by the end of the year, and gas as well at some stage.
Yeah, there's been a real sort of swing that they've had to go through in the past few months, and maybe some of this was predictable. Certainly the United States would tell the Germans that they predicted some of the problems they're currently having. But speaking of the United States, as the world's biggest economy, it's undoubtedly going to play a major part in whatever world emerges in the coming years. So let's hear from DW's financial correspondent in New York, Jens Korte.
There is a lot of talk in the United States as well if we might be seeing the beginning of the end of globalization, at least as we knew it in the past a couple of decades. The term deglobalization might be a bit misleading, because what most economists see is that we won't see the end of international trade, but that the United States, for example, is trying to cut the dependence on the supply chain, especially from Southeast Asia. There are terms like nearshoring, so for example that you try to bring production closer to the United States, for instance, or the head of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, she phrased it recently with friendshoring, so meaning that you try to bring production to countries that are friendly to you. I mean, that could, for example, in the case of the United States, be Mexico or other nations. And then we see already some trend in the fashion industry to bring some production closer to the United States, to Middle America, for example, countries like Guatemala or Honduras, and bringing some of the production at least back from Southeast Asia. And we've seen it not just what's happening with the war in the Ukraine, with the supply chains from China, but also if you think back what happened when the Suez Canal was actually blocked. So how vulnerable those supply chains are, and that's why nearshoring or friendshoring might be a trend for the future.
Jens Korter in New York for us. Friendshoring was a new one for me there. Anahita Toms, we were hearing the sort of point of view from the United States there on what the future looks like. Is Europe on the same page?
I think that the US and the EU are once again converging on global trade questions. We had our own trade wars, as you recall. I would say that under President Biden, the US is now again committed to the partnerships with friends and allies like Germany, like the European Union. And we are also seeing, again, a multilateral trade policy. We see negotiations. We see the Trade and Technology Council meetings in Paris developing quite well, where it's about strengthening trade and the labor dialogue, as well as focusing actually on common values like labor issues, like human rights. But also we're seeing that the US is getting back on track on overarching common ambitions like climate change issues. So I would say that there is, of course, protectionism. There is, of course, the Buy American wording that President Biden still uses, and he will constantly defend U.S. jobs. Nevertheless, I think that the geopolitical tensions and also the common values have brought the U.S. more closely again with Europe, and I think that this is going to last.
I think it's definitely going to be a values-based fracture we see around the world, but also a chance for many countries to suddenly have a say and play their part now, and not just be the US and the EU or China and whoever else. But we saw during the pandemic heaps of countries piling into Vietnam and producing there. Investors at Davos told me that Vietnam is now full. So we're seeing this overspilling into Cambodia. And Cambodia is trying to present itself as a transparent nation that will be a great business partner for producers around the world.
Okay, Ben. Well, we've heard a lot from the United States, and I mentioned comparing them. You know, we talk about the West, we talk about the United States, we talk about Europe a lot of the time. But let's hear from a European leader on this. I mean, so if we ask the question, is a world of regionalisation, localisation and nationalisation a better world? Well, for the last word on that, let's hear from the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who gave the final keynote at the World Economic Forum this time round.
Mehr wirtschaftliche Resilienz.
More economic resilience is the order of the day in this multipolar, crisis-prone world. And here, too, the answer must be diversification for politics and business alike. At the same time, we must be careful that the necessary diversification does not become a pretext for isolation, tariff barriers, and protectionism. To put it bluntly, deglobalization is the wrong track. It will not work.
The wrong track. Is that the message that you were hearing a lot from Davos, that deglobalization was wrong? I mean, you'd expect it from there, but is there any converts?
That was basically the message I was getting, along with a greener globalization.
Okay. Ben Fazulin, thank you so much for joining us on this DW Business Special, looking at decoupling and deglobalization. I would like to thank my guests, Ben Fazulin here in the studio with me, and Anahita Toms. Thank you so much for joining us from the international law firm Baker McKenzie. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, by the way, do remember to hit like and subscribe, as we always say here on YouTube. And also, you should check out our DW Business Beyond series. It's also on there. For me and the team, and from Ben here, it's a goodbye and thank you very much. Until next time, take care.